Well, thank you so much, Bill and Don and Louis, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here. It will take me probably a couple of seconds to set it up. Actually, I will not talk about selective influences, which is the topic within, classical topic within psychology that turned out to be mathematically very similar in many respects, similar to certain aspects of quantum mechanics. And actually, that was the way in which I personally was drawn into problematics related to quantum mechanics. Now I understand it much better why the things were so similar, because essentially both foundations of quantum mechanics and the issue of selective influences, both of them are about foundations of probability. We are dealing in both areas, quantum mechanics and psychology, we are dealing with fundamentally probabilistic situations when we cannot really predict anything deterministically, but we can predict probabilities of certain things occurring. And the issue related to the notion of a random variable, and especially to the notion of a joint distribution of several random variables, even though it looks like classical mathematics, long since established and completely clear, in fact, it is far from that. It is the area where people still discuss various possibilities, and it is as open in philosophy as it is in mathematics. You can set up the foundations of probability theory in a different way from how it is normally found in textbook of probability theory. So I would like just to make sure that I acknowledge the contribution by Yana Kuala, my very talented collaborator. And I would like to flash a couple of things. Let me see whether this works like this. Yeah, to flash a couple of publications upon which my presentation is based. And it is utterly uninformative to look at it, but I just wanted to make sure that you know that everything I will be talking about, even the things that are still in press or submitted for publication, they are available in archives, so anyone who is interested can always get over there and actually look at the elaborate presentations of what I'm going to present in a very imperfect way now. This publication, or actually paper that has not been published yet, is the main one upon which I will base my present presentation. So here is how I would like to begin it. Preliminary definition of probabilistic contextuality. It is all about systems with inputs and outputs. So it can be psychological system, biological system, or quantum system. And I have to disappoint most of you by saying that my only example that I will be using throughout the talk will be from quantum physics, not from psychology. And the reason for this is simply that only in quantum physics we have the situation for which we have definitive laws and regularities established. So I can talk about the things there in less hypothetical terms than I would if I used parallel psychological examples. So we have some inputs, alpha and beta. We have some outputs, which are random variables A and B. And we can say that sometimes it is clear, either normatively it should be so, or it is clear from some substantive considerations that there is a selectivity in how the inputs influence the outputs, namely that alpha selectively influences the distribution of A, beta selectively influences the distribution of B. And sometimes it also happens that there are cross influences. So actually when beta changes, the distribution of A also changes for a given value of alpha. When alpha changes, the distribution of B changes as at a fixed value of beta. So we have system with direct cross influences, in which case we say there is no selectivity in the influences, but there is also no contextuality to speak of. And I would like just to emphasize this fact here, because many examples, if not most of the examples that usually people associated with the term contextuality or context are actually falling within this kind of quote-unquote trivial cross-influence. So it's not really anything conceptually new. It is simply that certain things that we would not expect would influence outputs actually do influence that, and we call it a context. But it doesn't bring in any new conceptual means or conceptual needs for analysis. Now, what we have also, there are some situations, and I will demonstrate one of them shortly, when we have this influence selective, so alpha influences the distribution of A, beta influences the distribution of B. So system does not have direct cross influences. However, what happens is the following, that even though the marginal distribution of A, marginal means that A and B are jointly distributed, of course. Let's say, think about the trial by trial measurements, and you register A, you register B together, and by the virtue of being co-occurring, you can speak about their joint distribution. So marginal distribution of A with respect to this joint distribution of AB is not influenced by beta. Marginal distribution of B is not influenced by alpha, but the joint distribution of AB cannot be accounted for, cannot be explained, cannot be coherently understood if A preserves its identity, so remains the same random variable under different values of beta. And if B, and or, I should have said, and or if B preserves its identity under different values of alpha. So here we are dealing with a fundamental distinction between the two probabilistic concepts, the concept of a distribution and concept of the identity of a random variable. And we all know that different random variables can have the same distribution, obviously. So there is nothing kind of unexpected about it. Now, it becomes unexpected and kind of almost counterintuitive in certain cases when we almost certain that beta does not influence the distribution of A, but also there is no way A can change its identity under different betas. But if this happens, if I can demonstrate mathematically this third point, that the joint distribution of AB cannot be accounted for if the identity is preserved, then it is a mathematical demonstration of the existence of probabilistic contextuality. This is how I use this term. And I call it preliminary simply because I am pretty sure that this definition is only a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. So based on, well, I mean, it cannot be proved, obviously. It's a definition. I can define anything in any way I wish. But there are kind of persuasive examples that you can construct that would show that in some cases this may be true, but you still should not talk about any contextuality. So it's not sufficient. And I recently started to think maybe it's not even necessary. So it is preliminary in the true sense of the word. It requires further work. But this would suffice for our discussion today. Now, this is my best graphical depiction of the situation with two entangled particles. I have a friend, Arkady Plotnitsky, who has the distinction of being professor of English literature and a specialist in quantum mechanics simultaneously, and also a philosopher. And he severely criticized me for an attempt to present entanglement in any graphical form. Now, I can assure you that I know that it's not a veridical representation of entanglement. It is just kind of to help me in the discussion. It is so-called Alice-Bob experiment. This is Alice, this is Bob, I mean, somewhere behind that particle. And Alice can use one of the two settings, so-called direct axis, along which the spins are being measured. So it can be alpha 1 or alpha 2 for Alice. And for Bob, it can be beta 1 or beta 2, one of the two axes or orientations. Settings of the detectors, if you wish. I should not probably get into physics of that, which I don't understand very well myself. But the experiment consists of Alice. In a given trial, Alice chooses one particular orientation, Bob chooses one particular orientation, and they both simultaneously, from the point of view of someone third, looking at that, simultaneously measure the two spins, the spin of this particle and spin of this particle along this orientation. Now, spins along different orientations can have different distributions. In the case of so-called spin 1/2 particles, spin can be up or down, so there are only two possible values. Electrons are spin 1/2 particles. We can have more complex situations, but most of my discussion will be confined to this spin 1/2 Alice-Bob situation, which is the situation, in fact, to which the famous Bell type theorems pertain. And what we have as a result of this experiment, for every alpha and for every beta, which we have 4 of them, these combinations. So for each of the 2 alphas and each of the 2 betas, which are the settings of Alice and Bob respectively, we have the recording by Alice and the recording by Bob of the spin. And if it is spin 1/2, we have 2 possibilities, up or down, which I traditionally, following the tradition of physics, denote by +1 and -1. And then the situation can be described by the joint probability of the 2 spins being up and by the marginal probability of the Alice's spin being up and the marginal probability of Bob's spin being up. Or, alternatively, you can ignore marginals and look at the 4 or 3 out of 4 these probabilities. It's also possible. But this is convenient for me to do it in this way. And and since we have 4 of them, we will have 4 matrices like this. And in the actual Alice-Bob experiment, in compliance with the laws of quantum mechanics and in compliance with everything experimentally known, even though some physicists tell me otherwise nowadays, to the best of my knowledge from the literature, the marginal selectivity is satisfied in the sense that the Alice's measurement of spin up having certain probability should not depend on Bob's setting. In other words, whether Bob measures his spin along beta 1 or beta 2, the probability that Alice will measure spin up is one and the same in these 2 cases. The same is here along the different axes of Alice's. The same is here. This value is here. Now we're talking about Bob being independent of Alice's settings. So these 2 probabilities are the same. These 2 probabilities are the same. And this is called marginal selectivity in psychology. In physics, it has many different names. One of them is no signaling condition. So it is one of the fundamental principles according to which these marginal probabilities do not change. And if you remember my slide about tentative definition of contextuality, this is a necessary condition for our speaking of contextuality. So we have these 2 probabilities equal, these 2 probabilities equal, these 2 equal, and these 2 equal. This is marginal selectivity. If it is not satisfied, so if these red letters do not equal the counterparts in blue, this and this, this and this, and this and this, then in fact what we have is that we have to double index the marginal probabilities, and then we have direct cross influences, right? So we do not speak of contextuality in this situation. It is what I would call a trivial situation, which is not of interest. But if marginal selectivity or no signaling condition is satisfied, then we can ask, do we have contextuality here? Now, this is a diagram that presents the situation of Alice-Bob experiment kind of in a way that will be useful for our discussion. You can see that every outcome, so this is the spin recorded by Alice, and this is the spin recorded by Bob. They are double indexed, so it means that Alice's measurement was along axis 1, and Bob's measurement here was along axis 2, right? And when these 2 things happened, this setting and this setting by Alice and Bob respectively, then the measurements were A and B, and their joint distribution is known, which is shown by this double arrow. The same is true for any of the other 4 combinations of settings, treatments or conditions, 1-1, 2-1, 2-2, 1-2. But there is nothing at all there is no possibility to talk about joint distribution of this and this, for example, or this and this, right? So even though Alice here and here uses the same setting, 1 and 1, the other setting by Bob is different here. And as a result, this random variable and this random variable never co-occur. They should be recorded in different trials under mutually exclusive conditions. And so logically, there is no way to speak of their joint distribution, right? There is no co-occurrence of these two things. And the same is true about these two or these two or these two. So as a result, we do not have a joint distribution of all 8 random variables in here. We have only some of them known to us. Now, why aren't they the same, you might ask, and this is what was the, this is what actually we are talking about when we introduce contextuality. If we could identify the two, so if we could consider B12 and B22 just B2, irrespective of the measurement setting by Alice, right? So 1 or 2, it doesn't matter. What matters is just that the second setting is 2, so we can simply say it's B2. If this were possible, then there would be no need to talk about contextuality at all. And if it were the case, then we would have extremely simple situation, just 4 random variables, and we would try to find out what their joint distribution is. Now, this assumption is, in fact, what lies at the heart of all Bell-type theorems. The famous Bell theorem of quantum mechanics, or foundations of quantum mechanics, is based on the implicit assumption that this is the case. Yes?
Can you reformulate this just by saying that Alice and Bob are independent?
Independent in the sense of stochastic independence? No. No, they are not stochastically independent in the sense that, if we return back, this A and B under the same conditions, 1, 2, and 1, 2, A and B are not independent. This is one of the fundamental laws of quantum physics. In fact, they are correlated. And I will talk about correlations in a moment.
So it's a specifically quantum effect?
Well, not necessarily, because as I said, if it weren't particles but were some macroscopic objects, we still could talk about joint distributions, and they still could be stochastically interdependent, but in such a way that it would allow us to identify them by a single index. Let me explain it in a moment. It's exactly what I'm going to do. What is the consequence of single indexation as opposed to double indexation, right? Well, consequence, well, first of all, what it means is that instead of A sub ij, I will write just A sub I, right? Because j is irrelevant. And here, instead of bij, I write simply B sub j, right? And otherwise, the table remains the same. And now, if I consider the correlation, which, I mean, physicists call it correlation, but in fact, it is expected value of the product. It's kind of a non-normalized correlation. Expected value of the product of A and B, now instead of being in this form, it can be written in this form, right? But it looks totally innocuous, but it has some profound consequences. If I preserve double indexation, look here, A11 and B11 are correlated by R11, and these two correlated by R12. These two are correlated by R21, R22. These R's are completely unrelated to each other. They are computed from completely different random variables. So there is no way they should be related to each other in any way except by simple arithmetic. For example, if I form these linear combinations, which turn out to be important, the only thing that I can tell about these linear combinations, where I add 3 of them and subtract the 4th, is that they are between 4 and negative 4, just by laws of arithmetic, because they are each of them between -1 and +1, right?
On that second line, you got R11, R12 minus 1R.
Oh, second line. Yes, yeah. It should be 2-1, R21, right? Yeah.
Question is, you mentioned they aren't, you aren't subtracting the mean from the correlation, which you would have to get between -1 and +1, right?
No, each of these random variables is either +1 or -1, right? So,
Yeah,
so the expected value of the product is always between -1,
Okay.
even without normalization. But it's a good question. But now look at the consequences of single indexation. Now R11 and R12 are not completely unrelated to each other because A1 is being shared by the two, right? And these two, R11 and R21, they share B1. So these correlations now are not related to each other by their arithmetic values only. They are actually related by the way they are computed from the random variables. And it's exactly what Bell's theorem tells us, that now they are these linear combinations between -2 and 2 rather than -4 and 4, right? So it's quite profound, this difference. And this is what Bell's theorem is, or Bell-Clauser-Horn-Fine theorem, because each of them added something to the original Bell's. And this is something that we should expect always if there is nothing like contextuality involved. In other words, as soon as we know that A is not influenced by beta, we simply preserve its identity. So not only the distribution of A is preserved, but also the identity of A is preserved. And if it is the case, this inequality should hold. And this is what classical mechanical determinism or contextuality is. It's the world of chairs and tables and big clumsy objects. It can be presented in this form. This is just a compact way of writing those four inequalities before. And it can be considered to be no contextuality, the lowest level of contextuality, if you wish. Right? Now, what we know, and this is the only deviation from classical lack of contextuality that we know actually from science, is that in quantum mechanical entanglement, it is not the case. So there, by definition, by my preliminary definition, we do have contextuality, higher level of contextuality than in classical mechanics. So there is no way we can, so these inequalities are violated, and as a result, there is no way we can single index things, right? And if we cannot single index them, then there is contextuality by that preliminary definition, right? Now, the quantum mechanical explanation for the joint distributions of two spins in the Alice-Bob paradigm is possible if and only if these two conditions are satisfied. Marginal selectivity, which I already stipulated, it always should be satisfied. So there are no direct cross-influences. And in physics, direct cross-influences are actually forbidden by the most fundamental principles, such as special relativity. They can be separated by space-like intervals so that there is no signal can be sent from one particle to another, for the two measurements. So marginal selectivity there is very definitely satisfied. But instead of this inequality here, now we have these inequalities with arcsines. The same type of combination, linear combination, but it's linear combination of arcsines of this correlation. And this time it's normalized correlations, not the expected values of the product. Now, which would be the same, by the way, if the marginal probabilities are all 1/2, 1/2. Then it is the same thing, normalized or unnormalized. Here we have the situation which we also learned from quantum physics, and it is so-called Tsirelson constraints. So it is the same linear combination as in Bell's inequalities, but the upper bound here is 2 times square root of 2 rather than 2. And if the world was constructed according to this Tsirelson, and therefore I have those flying pigs here because it's an imaginary world, right? Even freer than the quantum worlds, right? Then we would have even more contextuality because the quantum inequalities, they imply this, but not vice versa. So this is a weaker form of inequality than the previous one. So we have even more contextuality here. And this is, again, something suggested by quantum physics, levels of contextuality. Now, we can also talk about all kinds of imaginary situations, just construct systems, at will that would have much higher level of contextuality than Tsirelson's inequality. The highest possible is complete chaos when there are no constraints at all imposed on R's except for their arithmetic values. So everything from Bell's classical lack of contextuality to the complete chaos, you can fill in this continuum by all kinds of systems possible. And we really do not know how to apply this contextuality thinking to biological system or social system. So there might be some kind of inequalities that also kind of violate Bell's inequalities in the case of human responses or social responses, possible. But this is a pure guesswork. We do not have any empirical evidence so far. Now, why do I talk about contextuality by default? Contextuality by default simply means that you always have to double index. Well, in the case of my example, you always have to double index automatically, whether you know that the thing is preserving its identity or not. You double index things, and then you find out whether you can get away with single indexation or not. If you cannot, then you are okay. At least you are guaranteed not to make a mistake, right? Well, in general, it is formulated in this way, that any two random variables recorded under mutually exclusive conditions are labeled by these conditions and considered stochastically unrelated. Stochastic unrelated should not be confused with stochastical independence. Stochastic independence is a particular property of joint distribution. Stochastic unrelatedness means they are defined on different sample spaces. And so they are not functions of one and the same random variable, whatever this random variable might be, right? Now, when this happens, it doesn't mean that you cannot, well, it's different things, sorry. Let me just explain that. When this happens, it doesn't mean that the stochastic unrelated things cannot be later related to each other. In other words, they can be imposed a joint distribution upon. But this imposition of a joint distribution upon stochastical unrelated things cannot be done uniquely. Generally, you have infinite number of ways of doing it, and the exploration of this infinite of the ways of doing it is actually what allows us to glimpse into the nature of the contextuality in this system. So,
would
yes.
example be the weights and the heights of individual?
Of an individual?
Regarded as having different sample spaces, nevertheless.
Well, no, not necessarily. The point is, the deeper point is that the joint distribution and stochastic relatedness or unrelatedness of the things is a matter of how you look at it rather than how it is. So by the virtue of being height and weight of the same person, you can consider height and weight to be measured, height and weight co-occurring. So I measure it for me, for you, for...
completely forget one of the variable.
Yes, it's perfectly possible. If I forget it, so in other words, if I have a bunch of weights and bunch of heights, and I do not know that they are related to each other by the virtue of being of the same person, then they are stochastically unrelated, yes.
Sure.
Yes, of course. But the point is that in some cases, there are kind of natural ways of creating joint distribution, for example, by physically co-occurring in the same person or at the same time. In other cases, it requires more artificial type of coupling. The technical term for this in probability theory is coupling. To couple means to impose a joint distribution. Now, no signaling condition is extremely important, by the way, and marginal selectivity, because without no signaling condition, science would not be possible. Everything will be interrelated with everything else. And we will not be able to study anything, any subsystem, if we didn't know what's happening on Mars or on a distant galaxy or something like this. So by far, the reason I'm mentioning it because one of the poetic views of quantum mechanics is that as if it was telling us something about interconnectedness of the entire world, or something like that. It's actually, it doesn't work this way. It would not be serious science if it were the case, right? Marginal selectivity is the way to say that if I just interested in alpha, how it influences A, then whether beta is this or this doesn't matter. I wouldn't be able to detect the absence of this factor, in my study of the influence of alpha upon the response A. But it's only possible because of that marginal selectivity. Now, all possible couplings. So I just mentioned this term coupling. Stochastical unrelated random variables can be coupled, imposed a joint distribution upon in multiple ways, and there are no privileged couplings. So even the identity coupling is not privileged really. It is just the one that kind of, people thought would be natural to assume in this case. But in fact, it is not the only possible coupling. The coupling that John Bell, for example, was considering in his classical theorem, right? So, but contextuality can be studied through the set of possible couplings. Contextuality in a system with inputs and outputs is characterized by finding which couplings can be imposed on the outputs labeled by different conditions, right? So because these kind of disparate distributions that have to be coupled together, different disparate distributions allow different couplings for different couplings. And so, if you study all possible couplings that are compatible with the situation known to you, then you get some insight into what kind of situation it is. Now, here is the demonstration. So we have this situation where correlations are being observed. For simplicity, I now will assume that the entire probabilistic distribution of A and B is characterized just by this correlation, right? So marginal distributions can be set equal to 1/2 all of them, so they are not informative. So just correlations, look at them here. And this vector of 4 correlations is the only thing that's known to us from the experiment. Now, these are so-called connections. They connect the random variables that are not jointly distributed, and according to the principles just stipulated, they are stochastically unrelated. But you can impose correlations on them, which is actually to couple. Now, the choice made in Bell-type theorem is that they are all perfectly correlated, so it's one and the same random variable, right? So this is this is one way of formulating Bell theorem. So say that if this vector of connections is 1, 1, 1, 1, then you formulate the theorem, right? In this way it becomes much less dramatic than it is usually presented. I think in February when I was here at another conference, I quoted a physicist who said that Bell theorem was the greatest intellectual achievements ever, not just 20th century or physics or whatever, just ever, right? So some people really think that it's extremely deep, and I actually, I kind of share it. That's deep, but it's not as fundamental as it's usually presented because it's based on this arbitrary coupling, actually, right? In view of my approach, it is just one particular choice of coupling. Now, suppose that you chose a different coupling, right? Then what? Well, here are things that you can say then. Many connections beside this one are compatible with classical constraints, right? It's just a fact. You can demonstrate it very easily. But if you are looking only for those connections that are compatible with and only with these constraints, in other words, if this constraint is satisfied, then the connection is compatible with it. If it's not satisfied, connection is not compatible with it. Then there are only 8 connections that satisfy this. It is Bell's connection, the classical one, and the other ones where some of the ones are replaced with negative ones, right? So that's one simple theorem you can prove. Cyrilson.
Structure to those pluses and minuses? I can't quite see it.
Well, two or all 4 of them.
I mean, you got reversals, so it looks like you got reversals through there, am I right?
It is reversals, right? But it's always any 2 or all 4 of them can be replaced with minuses, right?
Any 2 or all 4, and then
Yeah. So
you have okay.
right. So these 6, they have 2 of them replaced with -1s in any positions. It really doesn't matter, and all 4 can be also replaced.
Well, I'm trying to see it on the cube.
Yeah. Well, okay. So let's look at Cyrilson constraints. So this is the world, remember, which is a bit more free than quantum world. It's still kind of imaginary. But it's a very simple world because it's also based on the same linear combination, and only the boundary is different. And there are many connections that are compatible with this. But now if you investigate it and try to look for connections that are compatible with and only with Thirelson compliant R. In other, R is the vector of correlations that you know from the experiment, right? So you want a connection such that it is compatible with any observable correlations that are subject to this inequality and not compatible with any of them that contravene it, right? Then C should satisfy these constraints, and that's a particular area of a big polytope that these C's are filling, right? Not intuitive at all, right? But interesting. Now here is something even more interesting, and that's completely new. When I was here in February, I already had this result, but this one we obtained later, and it is about quantum mechanical constraints, right? Those that are actually dictated by the laws of quantum mechanics. Here is the inequality. And now I want, and again, it's the same thing here. Many connections are compatible. But now I want to look at those that are compatible with and only with quantum mechanic compliant correlations. And well, there are no such connections. There is no single connection that is compliant, that is compatible with and only with QM compliant Rs. It's quite a surprise in the beginning, because in the view of this, that many of them are compatible, but anyone that's compatible with QM compliant Rs will also be compatible with some Rs that are contravening this one, right? So you just cannot get it right. You always get either more or less than quantum. And this can be generalized beyond connections. Connections are particular kind of marginal constraints. I will not get into that to save time, but there is much more general way of constraining couplings, and this would be true for the most general way of doing it. Now, this is the next one is even more surprising to me, and here it is, forcing. Now, suppose that I'm asking about connections that are compatible only with QM compliant R. So I'm not adding with and only with, right? Or actually, I'm not adding with here. I'm saying only with, right? In other words, if this connection is there, then it kind of forces any compliant R to also comply with laws of quantum mechanics, right? So I'm looking for those, and they exist, but they only are compatible with the ones that are Bell compliant. Bell compliant things are also quantum mechanic compliant, right? It's a special case. In other words, a connection can force quantum mechanical compliance only in the form of classical mechanical compliance, which is kind of, which is very, very surprising. Now, I want to explain to you the first result. This result, no matching theorem, actually can be explained. And here is an explanation for it. So this is a representation of the quadruples of correlations that we observe. So this is the first correlation, this is the second correlation, and within each panel, the axes represent the remaining two correlations. Okay? So each panel is representing therefore four correlations, and this red area is the area of classical mechanics. So this is what Bell constraints is, right? The area around it, whatever is this color, blue or whatever, this blue area is Thirelson constraints. But this oval sandwich between Thirelson and classical is quantum. And as you can see, the classical constraints form a polytope in four-dimensional space. And Thirelson constraints form a polytope. And the quantum constraints are not a polytope. It's a nonlinear structure, right? And this is the reason we cannot match it by any marginal constraints imposed on 8 random variables. So it's relatively simple, even though it was completely unexpected to me when I obtained the result, because the result was not obtained in terms of polytopes. It was obtained by some kind of computation that showed we cannot find this thing. Now, for no forcing, there is no simple explanation. If anyone, comes up with some kind of insight, then I would be very much grateful. Why is it that every connection that is compatible only with quantum mechanical things should also be compatible only with Bell classical mechanics compliant things, right? Why is it that it cannot be compliant with things that are, within quantum mechanics, but outside the classical mechanics, right? It's always within. Otherwise, in other words, what it says that, if it is compliant with anything outside classical mechanics, then it's also compliant with something outside quantum mechanics, right? But if it is not compliant with anything outside quantum mechanics, that's only compliant with the things inside classical, right? I mean, I find that quite intriguing why it is this way, but it is how it is constructed. So that's essentially what I wanted to tell today.
Quick question. You
Sure.
built this whole thing up from the beginning with the Bob and Alice thing, which involved binary settings.
Right.
Was there any point in this where you lost the binary settings and we're talking about?
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, the general theory is completely general. It's not non-binary things, but it's like arbitrary random variables, right? Arbitrary random variables, and I mean random variables which can be represented as measurable functions from any probability space to any probability space. So the values of these random variables may be functions, for example, or sets or anything like that. So it's totally general, right? But the computations related to no forcing, no matching theorem are specific for binary things, right? That's because this is Bob Alice experiment only. In fact, computational complexity of this thing is enormous. I mean, it's really, if you want to investigate it in terms of possibilities, it's even for binary things, it's enormous computational problem. Yes?
You said that you had no examples so far in psychology, but could you imagine what could be an example?
Oh, no. I mean, I have many examples of the situations which are formally identical with the situation of Bob Alice experiment. Many. I just do not have any laws that would be comparable to the laws of quantum mechanics or Tyrrell-Song constraints or anything, that we would say it is established in psychology and so we can use it as an example. Well, I have shown to you this picture, and that picture was already kind of indicating one possible experiment. Although it is not the realistic experiment for reasons I will not get into, but here it is, just double detection experiment. You present one flash, another flash, and you are asking, is the left flash on or off, and is the right flash is on or off, right? It's, the results will be exactly represented in exactly the same type of matrix, right? Now, the trick is that in these situations, with most probability, marginal selectivity will be violated. And that is the main problem with all psychological things. We have actually enormous body of data collected in my laboratory on the things that I probably would be too long to describe, matching experiments and all kinds of experiments which, psychophysics kind of experiments. And in those experiments, we can actually sometimes achieve the situation when marginal selectivity is satisfied, but it's very rare. Mostly, marginal selectivity is violated, so there is a direct cross-influence, so making it not interesting. But when, in those rare cases when we can say that marginal selectivity is satisfied, then Bell's inequalities are satisfied too. In other words, people in our laboratory behave as chairs and tables, not as electrons, right? So they are obeying classical mechanics, right? No indication that we can violate constraints imposed by Bell's inequalities. Right? So that makes it interesting. I mean, there is this whole area, ably represented by Jennifer here, quantum cognition, where people actually collect things in psychology that they think would be formally similar to quantum mechanical situation. And some people such as Dietrich Aerts and Sandra Souza, they did some experiments with concept combinations. Like you have choice between two concepts and another choice between two concepts. And so you combine concepts together. And the idea is that it is formally the same as Alice-Bob experiment. Maybe Bell's inequalities are violated. And in fact, it was triumphantly published several times that Bell's inequalities are violated, right? As it turns out, it was based on the crude mistake. And crude mistake was that they never checked for marginal selectivity. It was violated everywhere too. In other words, it was not contextual situation. It was direct cross-influence. If you are choosing between two animals and between two animal sounds, well, you know, animals influence which sound you are choosing, and the choice of the sounds influences which animal you are choosing. No big deal, right? So that's the situation with psychology. We do not have anything good there in the sense that, you know, we can say it is not only formally identical with the experiment that we conduct in Alice and Bob situation, but also the results are comparable in some way. Right?
So marginal selectivity in quantum mechanics is locality.
It is locality, right?
There's a reason why you might want to think that you should have locality there. But is there any reason anywhere in psychology
No.
that's a principal reason?
Exactly. But this is exactly the point. Right. So, you know, there is a deep reason in physics, in quantum physics, why marginal selectivity is satisfied. There is absolutely no deep reason why it should be satisfied anywhere else. And as a matter of fact, it is rarely satisfied. So we usually have cross-influences everywhere in psychology. Nothing bad about it. It's simply that it prevents me from investigating contextuality in the pure form, right? Which definitely nature should not care about, right? But the nature is such that there are cross-influences in psychology, right? Yes?
I was wondering if this could be relevant at all in searching for an example. My example may come from systems biology, which is a fashionable area now where people study signaling inside cells. So in a yeast cell, various chemicals come to the surface and the cell responds in different ways depending on the chemical. For instance, the yeast cell can decide to mate or to migrate in response to different signals. And there is a certain area of studies where they talk about you know, the specificity of such signaling, such that if something happens, the yeast cell
Right.
responds correctly to that signal, and whether cross-signaling is there. So I don't know, this could be just
Yeah,
something to think about.
You are right. I mean, this type of examples, I'm kind of, not this particular one, but there are examples of that nature that I'm aware of, and some of them are within the same kind of domain. They can be formalized in the form of the matrices analogous to Alice-Bob situation, or perhaps some modification thereof with continuous outputs or something like that. But again, the question is that we usually do not have any a priori principles that prohibit direct cross-influences there. You know, two chemicals can interact in some way. I mean, I'm not being a chemist, I don't know exactly how you would do it, but they may very well interact, right? And in fact, since I have time, I can probably digress just a bit. It is very closely related to this so-called violations of the additive probability rule in quantum mechanics, right? That, you know, double slit experiment, it's not Alice-Bob experiment, but another famous quantum mechanical situation when you have two slits, you know, and electrons, and then you measure the probability of electrons falling behind on some screen within small area, and electrons should either pass through this one or this one, but you measure it separately, and then, you know, when you measure them together, it is not the sum of two probabilities, whereas they are mutually exclusive events, something like that, right? Now, that is indeed a problem, and it's indeed a deep problem, and in fact, you know, I could draw parallels, formal parallels between Alice-Bob experiment and that experiment too. However, when people use it outside quantum physics, and I heard biological applications, by the way, about this thing, and also in psychology, they simply look at the situation when there are two things, like, two chemicals, let's say, one produces something, another produces something. You put them together and it's not additive. And they say, well, we violate laws of probabilities. No, of course not, right? I mean, it's like, saying, I'm investigating, how fast the plants are being eaten by fish in the pond, right? So I put big fish and they eat certain number of plants. And I put small fish, they eat certain number of plants. And then I put them together and it's not the sum. Well, because the big fish can eat the small fish, right, instead of these plants, let's say. Right? So there can be all kinds of things that do not call for fundamental rearrangement of the probability theory, right, that are much simpler explanations in the situations like this. So that's why, that's why it is very difficult to reliably draw parallels between quantum situation and anything outside quantum mechanics, right? And maybe I attended recently some conferences with a lot of physicists around, and they are usually very skeptical when you speak about non-physical applications, right? And maybe they are perfectly right, because some of these applications, the serious part is that the situation is formally identical, yes, right? But the outcome is not, and therefore perhaps it's not interesting, right? And one more thing is that within physics, within physics itself, you can easily create macroscopic situations such that under certain conditions of observations, incomplete observation of the system, you will think that it's Alice-Bob experiment, right? But in fact, it is not. It is classical mechanics, right? And for a physicist, even though there is total formal identity of these two situations, for a physicist, they are completely different. One is interesting, one is not, right? And perhaps all psychology and biology falls within this uninteresting area. Maybe, right? Maybe, which means that I chose the wrong profession, a long time ago. Okay.
You have some more?
Yeah, I have a question. So, yeah, thinking along this one, I'm trying to understand, so just following up those two questions, let's make sure I'm following correctly. So that the Bell's theorem inequality describe quantum world, which is made of spins, electrons, and atoms. But the thing is, now psychological world, the psychological concept, and there's no reason to believe that Bell's inequality, whatever the quantum inequality, should also be applied to psychological world, should not be, right? These are just different non-physical worlds, right? Even though we use the same probability, quantum physicists, they use probability, psychology is probability, but that does not mean that the Bell's inequality should also be satisfied with certain psychological concepts, psychological world. Am I correct when I say that?
Yes, obviously. But there was no implication whatsoever that Bell's inequalities have to be satisfied anywhere. It's simply that if you have an experiment in which you record 4 correlations, right, any experiment, and then you form linear combinations like this, there should be some inequality that binds that, right? I mean, maybe they are definitely between 4 and -4. We know this, right? But maybe they are constrained more than that, and that's the question. Bell's inequality simply says that it's -2 and 2, and absolutely no one expects a priori that it should be the case. In fact, this is the very hope of those people who are interested in expanding the outreach of quantum mechanics, is to find violations of these inequalities, right? And surprisingly for me, for example, in those situations, in my experiments, in my lab, in those situations where marginal selectivity is satisfied, Bell's inequalities are satisfied de facto, right? There is no special reason why they should, right? But they are. And so that's just the empirical finding. Yes?
So on this issue about classical things having formal quantum analogs in terms of data and structure, do you see any advantage in applying quantum-like thinking or methods of analysis to classical situations? Like, for example, I think computer science, they sometimes do it because you have fewer variables. The lattice of propositions can be a lot smaller, so you can think about the problem more easily.
Right,
Second
right.
of all, there might be some sort of regularity about different situations. Or in your case, it gives you a way of looking for an interesting experiment that other people would not think of looking for and therefore never find.
Actually,
So there is a lot of value to
yeah. I agree with this comment. Yeah. So it's perfectly possible that even though on a fundamental level you say, well, this situation is classical, having nothing to do with contextuality or with quantum mechanics. However, it is convenient to use quantum mechanical formalisms in order to analyze it, capitalizing on the formal identity of the setups initial. And that may very well be the case. That may very well be the case. But I don't know, my own interest is or at least, my motivation behind, doing this type of things is to try to find out whether there is anything in thinking about biological or humans, biological organism or humans, in terms of some kind of, fundamental contextuality involved here, right? It would be interesting if it were the case, right? It's you can also alternative formulate in terms of determinism. What kind of determinism, governs biological things? Is it classical determinism, or, is this quantum determinism is just an aberration kind of thing, and everything else is classical, including sentient beings. So it's just my personal interest in that. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, as a matter of expedience and convenience, yes. Yes?
It seems like when you collect the data in one person about two things, that you'd always get the cross-influence. But if you collected the data from two individuals, say, that shared a background, but they're responding completely they're not reading each other's minds.
Well, but you have almost said what is the main problem here. They are stochastically independent as a result of this, right?
Well, they had a common background. Let's say that they had.
Well, yeah, that might be interesting. That's why I showed this crowd. Remember, maybe social type of things would be.
Well, they took a quantum mechanics course together. Now they're asking false questions.
Right. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but it might be an interesting thing.
Yeah. Whether you get this one right doesn't influence whether I get that one right. That is, the responses are independent of each other, even though they both are more likely.
It doesn't influence it causally, but it might be correlated.
Whether I said true on this question and whether you said true on this question. I mean, if we both know the subject, we're going to have a high joint probability of true and a low probability of false. But I won't, my knowing you said true wouldn't change my probability of saying true. So the probability of two truths is the product of.
Yeah, I can think of things of that nature. In fact, in all my writings about selective influences, I always give the examples where some of them are like what you have just described. For example, we know that tests, if a person or group of people take tests, the test results in different subjects are always positively correlated, right? So, and correlation can be high, right? So if you vary something like, preparation time for one subject, let's say, long, short, for another long, short, and then you look failed past this and that, you get formal Alice-Bob situation, right? And who knows, maybe something happens there, right? But I describe it hypothetical, kind of. I do not know any data about this type of thing. Now it is 15, I'm usurping your functions now. Are we supposed to take a break, or I'm happy to?
We're supposed to take a break now for a while.